Now, when might we feel pressured to read something that the apostates have written? Consider this scenario. The unbelieving husband of your Bible student sends his wife a link to an apostate web page and says, "Here, you better look at this and see what you're getting into." Well, your student is concerned, and she wants you to take a look and tell her what you think. Well, that's not an option. Paul says, avoid them. That doesn't mean reading apostate literature or searching social media to see what they're saying about us. So what do you say to your student? You might say something like this. I can imagine that this is very upsetting for you, and you certainly do need to know what you're getting into. I have a suggestion. We have nothing to hide. When you're at the meetings, listen carefully to what the brothers are saying. Watch how we interact with one another. Take note of how the organization is financed. Get to know the elders, their wives. Introduce yourself to the circuit overseer and his wife when they come. Visit world headquarters of the branch. I'll come with you. I'll help you. And I want you to get really acquainted with the organization. And if you do, I'm sure you'll soon realize that what the people are saying about us isn't true. Well, maybe you can think of a better answer, but you get the idea.
I can think of a better answer, David Splane. My answer would be, let's look at what the arguments are against my religion, because I know that my religion is God's one and only true religion on earth. I wouldn't be trying to persuade you to join if I wasn't 100% confident that I have the truth. If I have the truth, it should stand up to whatever arguments are levelled against it. So yes, I'll gladly look at that email. I'll gladly click on that link. I'll gladly look at whatever arguments are being levelled against my religion, because I know that they must be wrong, and I'm willing to prove to you that they're wrong. I think that's a far more satisfying and honest answer than what David Splane's suggesting, which amounts to just stick your head in the sand. I love the bit at the end there where he says,
I'm sure you'll soon realize that what the people are saying about us isn't true.
I'm sure you'll soon realize that what the people are saying about us isn't true. How can you be sure that they'll reach that realization if you're not even listening to what the people are saying about Jehovah's Witnesses? It makes no sense whatsoever. You're just giving a blanket dismissal and saying, oh, whatever it is, it must just be a lie. And I'm sure that I can prove to you that this specific argument, which I can't be bothered looking at, must be wrong if you'll only come to the Kingdom Hall and, what was it?
When you're at the meetings, listen carefully to what the brothers are saying. Watch how we interact with one another. Take note of how the organization is financed.
Take note of how the organization is financed? What does that have to do with anything? And furthermore, no one knows how the organization is financed because there's no transparency. When was the last time this organization told us how much money they have? How much money they're bringing in? How much money they're spending on settling child abuse lawsuits, which we'll get to in this video, by the way. There's zero transparency. Is he talking about where they read the congregation accounts and say how much money was spent on gas or electricity or on toilet paper? How is that sort of information going to refute or debunk an apostate argument that's being sent in an email? What does that have to do with anything? It's a deeply unsatisfying answer, but it's the only answer David Splane can come up with because he's a power-mad narcissist who just doesn't want his followers to listen to anything that in any way criticizes his organization.
Just a few drops of poison in a drink are enough to cause serious harm. And apostates often mix a few truths with lies. Do you remember Eliphaz, one of Job's false comforters? Some of what he said was true. Let's turn to Job chapter 5 and verse 13. He catches the wise in their own cunning, so that the plans of the shrewd are thwarted. He catches the wise in their own cunning. Does that sound familiar? Why, yes. The Apostle Paul said the very same thing at 1 Corinthians 3:19. In fact, in the marginal reference, we see in the little a in the middle there, 1 Corinthians 3:19. Paul may even have been quoting Eliphaz. So that was the truth. But how did Jehovah feel about Eliphaz's argument overall? Let's turn to Job 42, verse 7, and see how Jehovah felt about it. After Jehovah had spoken these words to Job, Jehovah said to Eliphaz the Temanite, "My anger burns against you and your two companions, for you have not spoken the truth about me, as my servant Job has." A few grains of truth were mixed in with falsehoods. And at least some of what Eliphaz said was inspired by the demons. How do we know that? He admitted it. Notice Job 4, verses 15 through 17. Eliphaz says, "A spirit passed over my face. The hair of my flesh bristled. It then stood still. But I did not recognize its appearance." Let's stop there for a second. I did not recognize its appearance. So he didn't know whom he was talking to, just like someone in a discussion forum may not know whom he is talking to. Let's continue. He says, "A form was in front of my eyes. There was a calm. And then I heard a voice. Can a mortal man be more righteous than God? Can a man be cleaner than his own maker?" Does it surprise you that a demon will get involved in the debate between Job and the false comforters? It shouldn't. This was no small debate. It was a big issue. Satan had challenged Jehovah in the presence of all the angels that no man would keep his integrity under test. That demon was using Eliphaz to demoralize Job and weaken his faith. This was something that Job had to fight for, and Job fought back.
When I was initially doing my prep for this rebuttal, I was debating leaving out this entire stuff about Job, which I consider to be quite tedious and not as interesting as essentially the rest of the talk. It is, after all, a 34-minute talk, and I wanted to basically save as much time as possible and spare you as much as possible anything in this talk that might be a bit tedious. But after discussing this part of the talk in the JW Watch episode with my colleagues, again, the episode's gone on to accumulate tens of thousands of views, I now see this part of the talk as, in many ways, just as interesting as the rest of the talk. He's appealing to the story of Job as an example of why it's important to completely block out whatever claims, whatever arguments apostates are coming up with. He's saying, just as Eliphaz, one of Job's comforters, was saying things that were mostly true but with some lies mixed in, apostates can do the exact same thing.
Just a few drops of poison in a drink are enough to cause serious harm. And apostates often mix a few truths with lies.
Apostates often mix a few truths with lies. That is a sweeping statement. It's a generalization. If you're going to make that sort of claim, what you really need to do is give an example. And yet, nowhere in this talk, despite him devoting 34 minutes to talking about apostates and the media, nowhere does he give an actual argument against the organization. And isn't that telling? The fact that he refuses to give any examples at all, even in this instance, where he's saying, well, apostates mix in lies with truths. Well, if that's the case, there should be any number of examples for him to draw upon where he can say, look, this apostate, for example, says this, And notice this lie. I'm now going to prove to you that it's a lie as just one example of how they're doing this. Imagine how compelling that would be. Of course, he could cherry pick just one example and use that disingenuously to infer that everything that apostates say are similarly laced with lies. But at least it would be one example. David Splane is such a coward and such a charlatan that he can't even come up with one example of apostates lying. Meanwhile, here on my channel, I am routinely uncovering examples of this organization lying to its followers. I've even produced a video on theocratic warfare, thumbnail will appear here if Tibor is gracious, showing 4 examples of Watchtower representatives lying on video. This is an organization that says it's okay to lie sometimes because the ends justify the means. This is war. We're in a war against Satan, and sometimes in war, you've got to loosen up a little bit with your morals. Sometimes you've got to tell a few porcupines. That's the sort of organization we're dealing with. And they have the gall to point to apostates and say that apostates are the ones who are lying. Again, without showing a single example. Then we have the irony of David Splane pointing to a Bible example of a worshipper of God being tested in a talk where he's essentially telling Jehovah's Witnesses that they shouldn't allow their faith to be tested. Think about what that whole Job story was about. As David Splane himself says,
This was no small debate. It was a big issue. Satan had challenged Jehovah in the presence of all the angels that no man would keep his integrity under test.
No man would keep his integrity under test. The whole point, apparently, of Job's comforters was that they were testing Job. Job went through that test and he prevailed. And yet David Splane is invoking Job in arguing that Jehovah's Witnesses are too fragile to ever be tested. In other words, if David Splane's logic were applied to Job, there wouldn't have been a story, there wouldn't have been any comforters. Job would have sat through the whole thing with his hands over his ears just going, la, 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 I can't hear you. Wouldn't have made for a very good story, would it? How ironic, if you think about it, that even the Bible verse that David Splane is cherry-picking in support of his arguments doesn't really support his arguments because it's telling the story of someone who is willing to listen to claims against his faith. Someone who is willing to listen to negative talk. Someone who is willing to sift truth from lies, to entertain a claim and decide for himself whether it's true or not, and decide for himself to what extent it will impact his faith. That's what the whole story of Job is about, and David Splane apparently misses this irony entirely.